Greetings, welcome back. Today we are in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 29, at least hopefully. This is a long and detailed passage, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to get through all of it in the time that I generally take for these. I might have to do 3 or 4 videos on this. But Mark 6 starts out with Jesus going back to Nazareth, his hometown. We are not told that this is Nazareth, but in 1:9, Mark says that Jesus is from Nazareth, so we can very easily assume that this is his hometown. He left Nazareth to go to Capernaum and set up his base of operations in Capernaum, but this is his home. And here we do see that Jesus has family connections, which definitely leads us to think that this is Nazareth, not Capernaum. And Jesus is going back to speak in the synagogue. Now, like churches today, if you were going to speak in the synagogue, you had to be invited, you had to be vetted, people had to know you. So Jesus is known in this town. He is well respected, at least well respected enough to be invited to speak in synagogue, and that is a fairly high honor. So we know Jesus is going to Nazareth. We know he is well respected. In Luke's gospel, when he tells this story, Luke says that the crowd turned hostile after Jesus spoke. Now, that may be true. I'm not discounting that. But in Mark's gospel, we don't get any glimpse of that hostility. Could they be talking about different events? Possibly. Could they be? Could the hostility be directed at Jesus a day or two after the synagogue speaking, and Luke is just condensing that time frame? Oh, certainly. But Mark doesn't show hostility. He just shows the people are somewhat indifferent to Jesus. Jesus speaks, people say he has power, or people are confused by Jesus's message, saying, well, he's just a builder. He has no background, no respectability. There's no reason why we should believe believe him and put so much faith in him. They talk about his background, his family. He has become common. He is very much provincial to them. And they would expect that a Messiah, that somebody with authority to really speak and proclaim the message, should be exotic, should be from Jerusalem, should have connections in the best circles, should have trained under the best rabbis and the best teachers. Jesus has none of that. He's just a provincial builder who we know his family. Yeah, they're a good family. That seems to be the reputation. They're a good family, well respected, but at the same time, very common, very ordinary. This is one of the temptations that we still run into with people, is that we want to look at their background, their provincial nature, the fact that they are close to us and common, and we want to deny the message or the gifts of these people, because we don't want to see them as more special than the rest of the community. So we can understand why Nazareth would have said some of these things about Jesus. But Jesus comes into this town, and he is he's trying to do the same works, the same miraculous healings that he does in other places. And he is met with resistance, not direct opposition. In the face of direct opposition, as in the last chapter where Jesus heals the demoniac, Jesus is able to overcome direct opposition. What seems to hang Jesus up in this circumstance, and the reason he doesn't do many works of power, is not that he is directly opposed. It is that people are indifferent. They're cold to him. They don't show him any concern whatsoever. And that seems to negate what Jesus is trying to do. And I think the reason for that is that God wants to work with people and in people and through people. And these people just refuse to be bothered by Jesus. How is God supposed to work in people and through people and with people when the people aren't bothered at all or concerned with the work that God is trying to do. And that's one of the lessons that we see out of this event in Nazareth is Jesus is trying to work, but the people aren't responding. They don't care. They don't care about Jesus's work. They don't care about his ministry. He's just a common person. So why bother? And that frustrates what Jesus is trying to do, because he is working with, wants to work with these people and through these people, even if the healing comes straight through him. He wants to be around people who believe, even if it's like the Father in Mark 9, where he says, I believe, help my unbelief. Now, Jesus does this, or Jesus leaves Nazareth. Oh, wait, before I get to leaving Nazareth, there's one last detail. In the midst of Jesus's family, as he's being told, or as people are talking about his family, we see that Jesus is identified by his mother, Mary. Now, this is unusual. Yes, it is likely, because Joseph isn't mentioned, that Joseph is dead, but paternity was very important. This was a very patriarchal system that Jesus grew up in. Paternity was very important. The fact that Joseph was dead would not negate them from saying Joseph's son. It would not negate that. That would have been a primary identifier. So the fact that that the people of Nazareth don't say that does point us to the idea that Jesus's lineage was questioned. There was a common belief in Nazareth, whether Mary and Joseph perpetuated this belief, told people stories, what have you. There was a common perception that Jesus was not Joseph's son. And that is evident in the fact that only Mary is identified. Joseph should have been identified there. And the fact that only Mary, his mother, is identified probably indicates that there is something different about Jesus's heritage. Mark does not come out and say anything about a virgin birth, and it's hard to say what the community in Nazareth would have thought. I would wager that if they thought that Jesus was virginally conceived, then they certainly would have been a little less indifferent to him in this instance. So I'm guessing that that's not what they believed, but it does seem like the community has this idea that Jesus has a reputation as not being Joseph's son. At least that's how I read it. It is possible to just read it that Joseph is dead and that their only concern is the living relatives of Jesus. That's possible, but I don't think that reading is quite as strong as saying there's something to Jesus's birth that the people all are whispering about because they want to identify Mary and not Joseph. So Jesus leaves the town, and he and his disciples are sitting together, and Jesus sends them out into the world to proclaim the gospel. Now, there's a few things we need to note. Number one, Jesus talks about you're going to face opposition. And the idea is that you can say that he just faced opposition in Nazareth, but he really kind of faced more of indifference than opposition. So it might be this note, along with anointing people with oil, are Mark's way of writing this story to highlight some of the practices of his church and to say, hey guys, look, we've been sent just like the disciples have been sent. It might be that the opposite, that Mark's church in Rome, that's the traditional place setting for this gospel, is Mark is writing in Rome. The Roman church was facing some opposition. They did things like anoint people with oil, and this is Mark's way of writing the gospel intentionally to say to them, hey, we're just like Jesus's disciples. We got this. It's possible. It is also possible that Jesus used this exact language and that it's remembered, but it doesn't have to be. Jesus could have said this in a number of ways. where you might face opposition or you might face indifference. There's a lot of ways Jesus could have said this, but I think it's kind of cool that Mark might have written this in such a way that his first readers were energized by the idea of being just like the disciples. I just think that's kind of cool. And then Mark also says to them that they are supposed to go out with the expectation of hospitality. Don't go out prepared. Expect hospitality and expect God to provide for you. This is a very challenging message because we often want to go out fully prepared for every eventuality, right? We want to be like the scouts, always be prepared. But Jesus is saying to the disciples, you don't need to prepare. You're going out in God's power. You're going out with God's Spirit. God's Spirit will take care of you. You will be shown hospitality. You will have people who hear you. You'll have people who listen to your message. Go out anticipating that and not with the expectation that I have to prepare for every eventuality because something could go wrong. Expect God to do great things. That's in the background of this. That is certainly in the background of all of this. That these people are doing it with the expectation that God is going to provide for them. There's also in the background, I think, that if you're taking no money purse, you're taking no real preparations, you can't take money from people. There's no chance that people are going to say, oh, these guys are just grifting, because all they're doing is accepting hospitality from people. They are not asking for anything. They're not asking for gifts. They're not asking for any kind of donation. They're just simply there to proclaim what they know. And if somebody shows them hospitality and kindness, that is great. If not, they kick the dust off their shoes and keep moving. And that is in itself a testimony that, hey, I'm not doing this for the money. I'm doing this because I genuinely believe in this message. And no matter how little hospitality you show me, I'm still going to do this. I'm still going to continue to proclaim this message. And that double side of taking no provisions is to me very powerful. The last thing in this section is that Jesus talks about or tells them to proclaim the gospel. Now, in our modern time, in our modern theology, the gospel is often associated with Jesus' death and resurrection. But that is not something that the disciples could proclaim. They can't talk about Jesus' death and resurrection. One, they don't know the first thing about it. Two, it wouldn't make sense to anybody because Jesus is still alive and well. So even if the disciples themselves understood it, they couldn't proclaim it. They couldn't talk about it, which means that their idea of the gospel must be different from the idea of the gospel is Jesus' death and resurrection. Rather, for them, what they would have proclaimed is what they knew, that God's kingdom, God's reign, had come into this world in the person of Jesus. Now, that is the only message that they would know. That must be the message they proclaim. That means if our definition of the gospel does not include that message, our definition of the gospel doesn't meet the definition that Jesus and his disciples used. It can include more. We know more of the story than what the disciples did at that point. They didn't know the whole story. Not to say that we know the whole story, but we know more of it. But if our definition, our proclamation of the gospel does not include what they said, we're only proclaiming part of the gospel. In other words, we can include more, but we cannot include less. We cannot do anything different, or we cannot do anything but add to this story. This story, this gospel message of Jesus has come into the world to proclaim God's reign and God's rule here in this world, that is the crux of the gospel. Yes, the rest of the story is very important. Yes, overcoming death and salvation are very important to the story, but they cannot exclude the message that the disciples would have told, because Jesus has sent them to proclaim the gospel. So if Jesus sent them to proclaim the gospel, our gospel must also contain what they said. Now, that being said, let's get on to the second part of this Markan sandwich. The first part is Jesus sending the disciples out, and then he interrupts the story. Mark interrupts the story with this, with what happened to John, and then brings the disciples back on the other side of this. And we'll have to get to that in the next part. We'll talk a little bit about the conclusion of this sandwich. But what John is doing here is he is talking about, first, how do people view Jesus? So we have the people in Nazareth viewing Jesus as just parochial, one of their own, but nothing special. Then we have the disciples who are told to carry out the gospel message. And then we have Herod, and we have how Herod reacts and responds to Jesus. Now, Herod is the ruler. He is, it's Herod Antipas. He is tetrarch in Galilee. He is a stand-in for all of the people in this case, or at least in some respects, he's a stand-in, because we see how the people, all the different views of the people, and then we see Herod's own view, because John wants to focus on the elite. Now, it is kind of interesting to think that Jesus is already getting noticed by the elites and by the highest authorities in his area. His message is making waves, because Herod doesn't just notice everybody. He probably doesn't notice every little preacher that's running around his territory. He only notices the ones that are actually making an impression. And so Jesus is making an impression. And we're starting to see the opposition. First it was the Pharisees, then the scribes, now Herod. We're starting to work through the events. The Pharisees are opposing Jesus, the scribes oppose Jesus. Now the governing authority is going to at least question, if not outright oppose, Jesus. And we get this story of Herod and his wife, Herodias. Now, this is a very complex dynamic. Herod is both a title and a personal name for the Herodians. So to just say Herod and brother and Herodias, these are all so common. It's very, very unclear, other than Herod Antipas, who we understand. The rest of the story, the people involved are very, very difficult to identify, because so many people share names, and they share titles, and it's just a very confusing web of a family. So other than Herod Antipas, I'm not going to try to understand who the rest of these people are, because it's very fruitless. But what we should see is that Herod arrests John the Baptizer, and he has John killed, and we're going to see that in a second. But Herod, because he's arrested and killed John, believes Jesus has been resurrected. But the way Herod says this, it's very, it's almost amusing, because Herod is very much saying that John has come back to torture and torment him. It's almost like Herod believes that his wicked action has caused John to, in some way, shape, or form, come back from the dead just to torment Herod. It is a very egotistical way to say it, but it also shows a lot of fear, because Herod doesn't talk about Jesus being a prophet, and he kind of says, this is my doing, and this is my personal torment. So the story is that Herod had John arrested because John was talking about Herod and his marriage to Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Now, what seems to have happened is Herodias had divorced Philip and married Herod Antipas. But according to Jewish tradition, Jewish law, especially a very strict interpretation, such a divorce is not legal. It's not justifiable, especially if initiated by the woman involved and not the man. In Jewish law, men were allowed to give certificates of divorce. Women were not. In Roman law, women were allowed to divorce husbands for a variety of reasons. What is likely is Herodias has divorced Philip in order to be with Antipas because Antipas was more powerful. And John is calling this out because it would go against God's law, and so trying to undermine Herod Antipas's power among the people. Obviously, if a politician is somebody who treats marriage as if it is a frivolous thing, then and the preacher calls them out on it, and they lose support because of that. It doesn't matter if you are, in some ways, if you are appointed by Rome and rule with an iron fist, you still want the people's popular support, because if you don't have it, then it makes your life more difficult. So John calling out Herod because Herod and Herodias don't uphold the sacred nature of marriage. Well, we can understand why that would make Herod mad, and mad enough to imprison John, especially since Herod doesn't really care. Herod is the kind of dictator who would do that. And obviously, when we see those character traits in politicians who are just willing, who treat institutions like marriage as frivolous, and then are willing to easily or quickly imprison those who speak out against them, or in some way just demean them like that, we should avoid those people. But Herod was in power, and there's nothing the people could do about it, so he has John arrested. This story is meant to highlight John as Elijah. While Herod and Herodias actually succeed with the plan to kill John, this is very much in the light of Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab and Jezebel were people who listened to Elijah, but listened half-heartedly. They would frequently listen to him talk, but they didn't really believe it. And they sought to kill Elijah after he upset them greatly. John is the Elijah figure here, who Herod listens to, but seems to listen to because of his own pleasure. He seems to get amusement out of it. If he understands John at all, he's not listening because John actually is convincing him. Herod just likes listening to this wild man, in his mind, rant and give these wild ideas, and Herod probably just chuckles and has fun with it. I can see this. I know the kind of people who they'll bring somebody in and give them a floor just to laugh at them. That's kind of what Herod is doing. He is stepping into the role of Ahab, who also ruled over this region, or close to this region, and Jezebel. And this time they succeed in actually killing John. We don't know who this daughter is. We don't know any details about the birthday party, the dance. Was it overly erotic? Who knows? It could have just been a simple dance. It could just be an artistic display. It doesn't have to be something that's overly erotic. Where the birthday was, who knows? Was John actually in the building? Was he imprisoned? Probably not. Herod definitely had houses all over the place, and he probably had prisons that were near them. But honestly, what this could be is Mark condensing the story into a day when this girl comes in to the party, dances for Herod. Herod makes an exaggerated promise, much in the style of Esther, where Haman, or not Haman, where Ahasuerus promises up to half his kingdom, that kind of exaggerated promise. Again, Herod being compared with a king who is gluttonous, who is useless, who is futile. Um, that's a little bit of a stab at Herod by Mark, um, to compare him with the king in Esther. But Herod makes this promise, and the girl asks for John's head. Well, it could be that they were having a party several miles away from where the prison was, and Herod just sent a messenger to the prison and said, "Behead John." And sometime later that day or that night, um, proof was shown to this girl and her mother that John had been beheaded. We don't know. And Mark is very clearly condensing this story in order to help the reader understand it. But the end is that John is killed, and we are meant to interpret that as, because John's time is over, Jesus' time truly has come, and his disciples' mission is truly important, because they are not only picking up on John's mission of prepare the way, they are picking up on the fact that John's role is over. Now a new message has begun, and that is that the reign and rule of God is here. And we're going to look at that in the next video.